My name is Teresa, but most people call me Tess. I'm 69 years old, and though I've weathered nearly 4 decades of widowhood, nothing prepared me for the sting of that night. The evening began with such hope. My eldest son had called, his voice unusually warm. "Mom, we're all going to dinner. A special place. Dress nicely." My heart fluttered at the thought of being included, of sitting at the same table with my grown children, like old times before distance and pride had built walls between us. I wore my best dress, navy with tiny pearl buttons. My late husband's watch rested on my wrist, its face scratched but steady, the only jewelry I could never take off. When I stepped into the restaurant, the most exclusive in the city, my chest swelled with nervous pride. But then I saw the table. 12 gleaming settings, candles flickering, crystal glasses catching the light, and not one chair for me. Victoria, my daughter-in-law, leaned back in her silk dress, lips curling. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere less fancy." Her words cut deeper than any blade. My sons looked away, silent, as if her cruelty were nothing more than truth. I felt a sharp laugh rise, bitter and raw, and I let it spill into the hush. Heads turned, the room stilled. I walked past my children, straight to the owner, and his eyes lit up in recognition. Because what my children didn't know was that this restaurant was mine. I wasn't born into comfort. My childhood was stitched together with frayed hems, secondhand shoes, and the smell of ironed uniforms. My parents worked themselves raw in a mill town where noise and dust were as constant as the air. My father came home with his lungs coated in soot, my mother with her hands swollen from scrubbing other people's laundry. They didn't have much, but they carried dignity like a badge, and I learned early that hard work might not make you rich, but it could make you honorable. I married young, just 19. His name was Samuel, and to me he seemed carved from oak, steady, dependable, with a voice that softened when he said my name. We didn't have money, but we had dreams. Samuel promised me a life built with calloused hands and faith in tomorrow. I believed him with all the stubbornness of a girl who thought love could carry any weight, and for a while, it did. We had 4 children, Daniel, the serious one, Marcus, born with a laugh, Joseph, my gentle boy, and my only daughter, Elena, delicate as glass and fierce as fire. They were my world, each heartbeat tethered to mine. But when I was 30, life pulled the rug from beneath my feet. Samuel never came home from the factory. A snapped cable, they told me. Quick, they said, as though that should be a comfort. I was left with 4 children and no savings, only a bundle of Samuel's belongings handed to me in a dented metal box. Inside that box was a set of brass keys, his work keys. Heavy, tarnished, nothing special to anyone else. But to me, they became everything. Samuel had once pressed those keys into my palm and said, "These open doors, Tess, and one day I'll find us a better one." He never got the chance. So I carried those keys everywhere, a reminder that promises could outlive the man who made them. The years that followed were a kind of battlefield. I found work as a housekeeper for wealthy families, dusting shelves I could never afford, polishing silver I would never own. 40 years I gave to other people's homes. I scrubbed their marble floors until my back screamed, pressed their sheets until my fingers cramped, and still, I rose each morning and thanked God I had the strength to keep going. There's a certain dignity in labor, even when it's invisible. I never complained, never showed the shame others might expect. My children needed food, books, shoes. They needed to believe they could reach further than I ever could. So I patched clothes instead of buying new, skipped meals so their bellies would be full, and sold my wedding ring when Daniel needed money for college applications. At first, my boys saw me as strong. I could see it in their eyes when I stitched their uniforms late into the night or made soup stretch across 3 dinners. But children grow, and pride can turn sour. By their teenage years, Daniel and Marcus in particular began to resent the life I held together with nothing but grit. They looked at the rich families I worked for and saw everything we weren't. I'll never forget the day Marcus refused to let me hug him outside his school because I still wore my housekeeper's uniform. "People will see, Mom," he whispered, shame burning his cheeks. That hurt more than cracked skin or tired bones. Joseph stayed close, my sweet boy, but even he began to step back when the others mocked the smell of cleaning solution that clung to me. And then there was Elena, my beautiful, fragile Elena. She was born with a weak heart, the doctor said. We managed with public hospitals, waiting rooms filled with coughing children, and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. When her health turned, they told me a private clinic could save her, but the cost was beyond anything I could imagine. I begged, I borrowed, I sold everything I owned, but it wasn't enough. She slipped away at just 10 years old, her hand so small in mine, whispering she was tired. That loss hollowed me. I buried part of myself with her. Still, I couldn't let the boys see me fall apart. I worked harder. I told myself Elena's absence had to mean something, that I needed to build a legacy for the children I still had. That's when the idea of investing began. I had no training, no business sense, but I knew one thing: I could not die with nothing left behind. Every tip, every extra shift, every coin I could spare went into savings. And then an opportunity appeared. One of the wealthy families I worked for owned a restaurant, small, modest at first, but with potential. I listened quietly when they spoke about expansion and struggles. I asked careful questions, and when the chance came to buy a tiny share, I took it. They laughed at first, at the housekeeper wanting to play investor, but my money was real, and they didn't refuse it. It was only a small stake, nothing that would change my life overnight, but it was mine. For the first time, I wasn't just scrubbing someone else's table. I had a claim, however small, to a place where people gathered, celebrated, and dined with pride. I didn't tell the boys. It was my secret, a seed planted in silence. As the years passed, I kept reinvesting. I said no to small pleasures so I could say yes to more shares. Shoes could be mended, dresses could be patched, but ownership was a legacy. I imagined Elena smiling somewhere, knowing her mother was finally building something that couldn't be swept away. Meanwhile, my sons grew into men. Daniel married Victoria, whose laughter often carried a sharp edge. Marcus chased money and status, always restless. Joseph tried to balance between them, often caught in the middle. They grew more distant, their calls fewer, their visits shorter. They gave me gifts on holidays, but behind their polite words, I felt the weight of unspoken embarrassment. To them, I was still just a housekeeper. A woman who smelled of bleach and carried old brass keys on her keychain. They never saw the papers I kept hidden, the ones that bore my name alongside the restaurants. They never asked what I wanted, what I was building, or who I had become, and perhaps that was my fault too. I let them think of me as small because it was easier than forcing them to see the truth. I thought I was protecting them, sparing them from the weight of my sacrifices. I thought, foolishly, that one day they would look back and understand. But standing in that restaurant with Victoria's cruel words hanging in the air and my sons looking away, I realized something. The seeds I had planted weren't just in shares or savings. They were in me, quiet, patient, waiting for the right moment to bloom. And the night they tried to humiliate me was the night those seeds finally broke the surface. The call came on a Wednesday evening, unexpected and almost tender. Daniel's voice, smooth and careful, said, "Mom, come to dinner. Formal family event. We want you there." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My children rarely asked for my company unless it was Christmas or a birthday, and even then, the invitations carried a sense of obligation rather than warmth. But this time, Daniel's tone was different, softer, almost affectionate. My heart leapt before my mind could intervene. Maybe this was it, the moment I'd waited for all these years. Maybe they were finally ready to see me, not as a burden, not as an embarrassment, but as part of their lives again. A proper part, with a seat at their table. I spent the next 2 days preparing like a young bride. I ironed my best navy dress, the one with the tiny pearl buttons I had saved for important moments. I polished my shoes until they shone in the dim light of my kitchen. And on the evening itself, I fastened Samuel's watch to my wrist. The glass face was scratched, the strap worn, but it ticked steadily, as though his heartbeat still guided me. I whispered to him, "Wish me luck, Sam. Maybe tonight they'll finally see me." The restaurant glowed like a palace when I arrived. Candles shimmered in tall glass holders, violins drifted softly from hidden speakers, and the smell of roasted garlic and butter clung to the air. I paused at the entrance, my pulse quickening. This was not a place I ever thought I'd step into as a guest. Then I saw them. My children gathered around a long table set for 12. Crystal glasses gleamed, silver cutlery lined in perfect rows. My sons in tailored jackets, Victoria in a silk gown that seemed to float when she moved. Laughter spilled from their lips as though the night already belonged to them. I approached slowly, my hands folded, my heart swelling with a fragile kind of pride. But as I reached the table, my eyes searched for an empty chair. There was none. Every seat was taken, every place card already claimed. For a moment, I thought it must be a mistake. Perhaps the waiter had forgotten to add a chair. Perhaps someone was still in the restroom. I hovered, uncertain, waiting for one of my sons to rise to say, "Here, Mom, sit next to me." Instead, silence. Victoria turned her head, her lips painted crimson, her smile sharp. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm afraid we didn't think to add another seat. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere less fancy." The words landed like stones. I felt my throat tighten, the air thinning around me. Less fancy. As though I were dirt on her shoes, an unwelcome stain in her perfect picture. I looked at Daniel, my eldest, the one who had called me. His eyes slid away, fixed suddenly on the bubbles rising in his glass of champagne. Marcus gave a weak chuckle, as though to soften Victoria's cruelty, but he said nothing. Joseph, my quiet boy, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Not one of them rose to my defense. Not one of them claimed me as their mother in that moment. The waiter, standing nearby, shifted awkwardly. His eyes met mine, full of pity, and somehow that stung more than the insult. I didn't want pity. I wanted respect. A heat rose in my chest, spreading like wildfire. At first it was shame, crushing and heavy, pressing me down. But beneath it, something else stirred. A bitterness, yes, but also a resolve sharper than any blade. For years I had bent, folded, sacrificed, always believing that one day my children would see me. And now, here I was, standing at the edge of a table that should have been mine by right. And they treated me like an intruder. I straightened my back. My hands, still trembling, found Samuel's watch. I pressed my fingers against it, felt its steady pulse, and suddenly I knew. This night was not meant to break me. It was meant to reveal them, so I let a laugh escape my lips. Not a cheerful laugh, but something darker, richer. It sliced through the air, startling every head in the room. Forks paused mid-air, conversations halted, even the violins seemed to fade into silence. Victoria's smile faltered, Daniel's brow furrowed. Marcus blinked in confusion, and Joseph lowered his gaze, shame painting his cheeks. I laughed because the pain had burned itself into something else, something fierce. I laughed because they thought they were humiliating me, when in truth they were handing me the stage. And as the hush deepened, I stepped away from their table, away from the pitying waiter and the unclaimed seat that was never meant for me. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step steady, deliberate. I walked straight to the owner. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw recognition spark, like fire catching dry wood. His expression shifted from surprise to warmth, and then to something that looked very much like respect. And in that moment I knew the tide had turned. My children thought they had placed me beneath them. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very ground they stood on belonged to me. The humiliation they served so coldly had become the very spark I needed to stand taller. And as I faced the owner, my resolve hardened into steel. My children were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. I did not return to their table. Instead, I lingered near the edge of the dining room where I could see everything without having to endure their smug faces directly. From my quiet vantage, the truth of the evening unfolded clearer than crystal glass. Victoria, radiant in her silk gown, leaned forward as if she were the queen of some glittering court. Her bracelets clinked softly whenever she raised her glass, deliberate music to remind everyone of her wealth. She laughed too loudly at things Daniel said, and her eyes often darted toward me with that same cutting smirk, half mockery, half triumph. My son sat there, oblivious to the shame that dripped from every gesture. Marcus tipped his glass, swirling the deep red wine as though he knew anything about vintages. Daniel spoke with authority, like a man born into privilege rather than one raised on soup stretched thin with water. Joseph remained quieter, his shoulders stiff, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He, at least, carried a sliver of conscience, though it was buried beneath cowardice. The longer I watched, the heavier the weight in my chest became. I thought of nights long ago when those same men had fevers that racked their tiny bodies. I remembered laying cool cloths on their foreheads, humming softly while I prayed their breathing would steady. I thought of patching their school uniforms so carefully, turning threadbare fabric into something presentable, my fingers pricked and bleeding but determined. And I thought of the countless evenings I skipped supper so they could scrape the last bit of stew from the pot, my stomach twisting while they licked their spoons clean. Did they not remember, or had they chosen to forget? As Victoria's laughter rang out again, anger burned in me. But it was not the wild, uncontrolled fire of youth. It was older, steadier like embers that had smoldered for years and were now ready to ignite. I let my gaze wander the restaurant, needing something to ground me. That was when I saw the portraits, large oil paintings hung along the far wall, each one depicting a former owner of the establishment. Men in tailored suits, women in gowns, all captured with that air of permanence only the wealthy seem to possess. Their eyes followed the room with quiet authority, as if to remind every guest that this place was no mere restaurant but a legacy. And there, near the host's podium, was a glass cabinet glinting under the lights. Inside lay polished silver keys, ceremonial, engraved with names of past proprietors. They were displayed like trophies, symbols of ownership and continuity. My hand instinctively touched the weight in my purse where Samuel's brass keys rested. Old, tarnished, ordinary, yet they had been the first symbol of a promise. Keys that once opened factory lockers now sat in my handbag as a reminder that doors could always be opened again. Silver or brass, they carried the same truth. Ownership mattered. My mind drifted back to the first time I bought into this place. I had worked an extra month without a single day off, saving tips in an envelope tucked beneath my mattress. I walked into the manager's office trembling, clutching that envelope as though it were made of gold. They looked at me strangely, a housekeeper with calloused hands wanting to invest, but they took my money. And with that, I owned the smallest sliver of this dream. I never boasted, not even to my children. Each time I earned more, I bought more shares. I lived simply, denied myself luxuries, because every coin reinvested was a brick in the foundation of something lasting. Slowly, silently, my stake grew until one day I held the majority, and still I said nothing. I kept the papers folded carefully in a folder hidden at home, like secret love letters written to a future only I believed in. For years, while my sons sneered at my plain clothes, I was building a legacy none of them could see. And now here we were, in the very palace they thought was too grand for me, while I held the true crown in my hands. I glanced back at them. Victoria leaned closer to Daniel, whispering in his ear. Marcus laughed with a flourish, tossing his napkin like he owned the room. Joseph sat stiff, his gaze on the tablecloth as though it held secrets. The humiliation of the missing chair still pressed against my ribs, sharp as a blade. But instead of cutting me down, it carved clarity into me. This was no accident. It was a declaration. In their eyes, I was lesser, unworthy, invisible. But they had underestimated me. I took a slow breath, letting my anger and sorrow braid together. The temptation to march over and slam the deed onto their table was strong, but I knew better. Timing mattered. I had scrubbed enough floors in my life to understand the rhythm of things, when to bend, when to rise. Not yet, I told myself. Let them bask a little longer in their arrogance. Let the humiliation peak until their cruelty is undeniable, until every guest in this room sees the truth of who they are. Then, and only then, would I strike. I shifted my gaze once more to the cabinet of silver keys, their shine catching the candlelight. I thought of Samuel's words, These open doors, Tess. He had been right, though neither of us could have guessed which door it would be. This was no longer just about dignity, it was about justice. My children had turned their backs on the woman who gave them everything. They had chosen to side with wealth, appearances, and shallow pride. And tonight, in the very place where they sought to humiliate me, they would face the weight of the truth I had carried in silence all these years. So I waited. Standing tall, hands steady, brass keys resting in my purse like a heartbeat, waiting for the exact moment when their cruelty reached its peak. Waiting for the silence that would fall before the storm I was about to unleash. Because once I spoke, nothing would ever be the same again. The laughter at their table swelled, as though the sound itself were meant to push me further into the shadows. Victoria, glowing beneath the chandelier's light, lifted her manicured hand and summoned the waiter. "Bring another bottle of champagne," she declared. "The best one you have. Tonight is special." Her voice carried across the room, each word dipped in arrogance. My sons chuckled, pleased by the attention, raising their glasses in an easy rhythm. To the other guests, they might have looked like a family celebrating some triumph. But to me, watching from the corner, it was a cruel theater where I was cast as the forgotten extra. Then came the comment that snapped the last thread of restraint. "Not exactly your kind of place, is it, Tess?" someone said. The voice was Marcus's, light and teasing, but heavy with mockery. He hadn't even glanced at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed on the bubbles in his glass, as if dismissing me could be done casually, without consequence. A hush filled my ears, drowning out the violins, the clink of cutlery, the murmur of other conversations. Something inside me shifted. I had waited long enough. Slowly, I rose from my corner. The scrape of the chair against the polished floor caught attention, turning heads before I even took a step. I didn't rush. My heels tapped steadily, my spine straight, my chin lifted. The maitre d', elegant in his black suit, noticed me approaching. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, as if wondering if I belonged. Then his eyes widened with recognition. "Madame Teresa," he breathed, his voice warm, reverent. He stepped forward swiftly, almost tripping over himself in his eagerness. He bowed slightly, then took my hand and pressed his lips to it. The entire dining room froze. Forks clattered against plates. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Gasps fluttered through the air like startled birds. Victoria's smile vanished. Daniel blinked as though he'd misread the entire scene. Marcus leaned back, suddenly less sure of himself. Joseph's jaw tightened, eyes darting between me and the maitre d' with confusion. "Madame," the maitre d' continued, straightening, "I am so sorry we did not recognize you at once. Please allow me to prepare your usual table." My sons exchanged frantic glances. Their mother had a usual table here? What did that mean? I didn't even look at them. Instead, I let a calm smile touch my lips and said, clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "I would like the best table tonight." "Yes, of course," the maitre d' replied, bowing again. He gestured to a prime spot in the very center of the room, a place reserved for dignitaries, celebrities, people whose names carried weight. "It will be ready in moments." And just like that, the balance shifted. The owner himself appeared from the back, a silver-haired gentleman in a crisp white jacket. His eyes lit up the moment they fell on me. "Teresa!" he exclaimed warmly, striding forward. He clasped my hands in his and kissed them as though greeting royalty. "What a joy to see you." "We are honored tonight." More gasps. Chairs squeaked as guests leaned in to whisper. Who was this woman they had dismissed as ordinary, only to see her welcomed like a queen? I caught Victoria's expression. Confusion twisted into irritation, her lips tightening until her painted smile cracked. Daniel's face flushed red, and Marcus looked as though someone had knocked the wind from him. Joseph, though, lowered his gaze, shame flickering across his features. The maitre d' pulled out the chair at the grand table in the center, and I allowed myself to be seated with a grace I hadn't felt in years. A linen napkin was placed across my lap. A crystal glass was filled with sparkling water. To the onlookers, I was no longer invisible. I was a figure of significance, the center of gravity in the room. I rested Samuel's watch on the table, the metal catching the candlelight. My fingers brushed my purse where the brass keys waited. And then, for the first time that evening, I let my eyes meet my sons. They looked unsettled, whispering to one another, trying to piece together what had just happened. Their mother, the woman they hadn't thought worthy of a seat, was now commanding the attention of the entire restaurant. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then I spoke, softly but with unmistakable weight. "You asked if this was my kind of place," I said, my voice carrying. "And you were right, it is." Their brows furrowed, the puzzle deepening. Victoria tilted her head, suspicion narrowing her eyes. "This restaurant," I continued, letting each word fall slowly, deliberately, "belongs to me." The whisper spread like wildfire. "It belongs to her? Did you hear that?" "She owns this place." The dining room buzzed with disbelief. Daniel's glass trembled in his hand. Marcus leaned forward, whispering furiously to his brothers. Joseph stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as though trying to reconcile the mother he knew with the woman now seated in power. Panic flickered across their faces. The roles had shifted. They were no longer the hosts of the evening. They were guests in my house. I sat back in my chair, calm and poised, as waiters hurried to ensure every detail of my comfort. And I let the truth sink into them like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples unstoppable. The dining room still hummed with shocked whispers when my sons finally rose from their table. Their faces were flushed, their movements stiff, as though dragging themselves through invisible mud. They crossed the floor and stood at the edge of mine, blocking the candlelight. Daniel, always the boldest, leaned down. His voice was low, but not low enough to escape the ears of nearby guests who pretended to busy themselves with menus. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" I folded my hands neatly on the table. "Tell you what, Daniel? That you?" He glanced around, lowering his tone further. "That you own this place." Before I could answer, Marcus leaned in, his jaw tight. "Do you realize what you've done? You embarrassed us." In front of everyone. His eyes darted toward Victoria, whose expression burned with fury. Joseph stood a pace back, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders rounded. His silence said everything. He couldn't defend me, but he couldn't defend them either. Victoria stepped closer, her perfume sharp, her voice louder than it should have been. "Please, owning a few shares doesn't mean you belong here, Tess. Don't get carried away." She let out a brittle laugh meant to win the room back to her side. I took my time, lifting my purse from the chair beside me. The leather was worn from years of use, the stitching frayed, but inside it was something far stronger than any champagne toast or cutting remark. I withdrew the envelope I always carried, its edges softened by handling. With deliberate care, I laid the folded deed on the linen tablecloth and slid it toward them. The gold seal glimmered faintly in the candlelight. My name, Teresa Alvarez, was printed in bold black letters across the top. "This," I said calmly, "is not a share. It is ownership. Every stone of this restaurant, every glass, every table, you're standing in a house I built with my own sacrifices." Gasps broke out around us. A waiter stumbled, nearly dropping a tray. Guests leaned closer, no longer even pretending not to listen. Victoria's face blanched, then flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, shut it, then forced a tight smile. "Paperwork doesn't change appearances," she hissed. "You'll always be." She caught herself, but the venom was already dripping. A housekeeper playing dress-up. Her words cut, but only for a heartbeat. I steadied myself with the memory that had carried me through darker days. I saw Elena's small hand in mine, her face pale with fever. I remembered sitting in that hospital hallway, clutching brass keys in my pocket because they were all I had to hold on to, knowing I couldn't afford the care that might have saved her. That night I promised her, though she never heard me, that I would build something lasting, something her brothers could never erase. It was after she passed that I started putting aside what little I could, coin by coin, into the restaurant. At first, it was a sliver of ownership, hardly noticeable. But I kept going. Every pay raise, every overtime shift, every holiday bonus poured into this place. I scrubbed floors by day and signed contracts by night. Slowly, the sliver grew until it became the whole. I looked at my sons now, men who had once clutched at my skirt when they were frightened of thunder. Men who had eaten because I skipped meals. Men who now looked at me as though I were a stranger. Embarrassed? I repeated softly, meeting Marcus's eyes. You speak of embarrassment when you left your mother standing without a chair in a restaurant she owns? Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus pushed back. We didn't know. You could have told us, Mom. You could have said something before making a spectacle. I kept my voice steady, though my hands trembled under the table. I didn't invest in this place to boast. I did it because one child of mine never had a future, and I swore her brothers would. This restaurant is her legacy, and mine. I never needed applause. But I will not be hidden like shame. The words struck. Joseph's head bowed lower, his hand covering his mouth. His shoulders trembled faintly, as though he was holding back more than just tears. Victoria tried again, her tone sharper now, desperate. You think this changes anything? They're my husband's, Tess. They don't answer to you. A deed is just paper. You can't buy respect. Her words echoed too loud, too harsh. All around us, guests had turned openly to watch. The whispers weren't subtle anymore. I heard one voice murmur, "She owns it," and another reply, "And they mocked her, their own mother?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was already leaning toward me, waiting for my words. Respect, I said slowly, is not bought. It is earned, kept, and guarded. I earned mine on my knees scrubbing floors so you could sit in schools. I guarded it through hunger, through ridicule, through the loss of a child. And tonight, when you denied me a chair, you didn't just shame me. You shamed yourselves. The silence afterward was heavy, broken only by the clinking of a distant spoon. Daniel finally spoke, his voice raw. We didn't know, Mom. No, I interrupted, firm but not cruel. You didn't care to know. You never asked what I carried in my purse all those years. You never asked why I kept working long after I could have stopped. You were ashamed of my uniform, but you never wondered what it paid for. Tonight, you've shown the world who you are, Joseph whispered, barely audible. She's right. His eyes were wet when he finally looked at me. For a brief moment, I saw the boy he once was, clutching my hand after scraping his knee, whispering, "Sorry, Mama." But Daniel and Marcus stood stiff, caught between pride and exposure. Victoria's face hardened like stone. She had lost control of the evening, and she knew it. The maitre d' returned discreetly, offering me a fresh glass of wine. His presence was like a seal on the moment. I belonged here, and everyone knew it. My sons' voices dropped to hushed arguments, but the damage was done. The public confrontation had spread like fire through dry grass. Strangers now knew the truth, that the woman shunned at her family's table was, in fact, the woman who owned the ground beneath their feet. And for the first time all night, I sat back in calm dignity, the brass keys in my purse pressing against my palm, a reminder of promises kept. The weight of the room pressed in, every gaze fixed on us. Crystal glasses hung mid-air, forks hovered above plates, but no one dared to move. My sons stood around me like judges at a trial, yet I was no longer the accused. I was the witness, the jury, and, at last, the truth itself. I drew a breath and lifted my chin. Sit, I told them. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Slowly, reluctantly, Daniel and Marcus lowered themselves into the chairs opposite mine. Joseph hesitated, then slid into the seat beside me, the gesture quiet but full of meaning. Victoria remained standing, her arms folded tight across her chest, eyes darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. I rested my hands on the table, steady as stone. You want to know why I never told you about this place? My voice carried clear across the room. It's because my life has never been about boasting. My life has been about survival. I paused, letting the silence deepen. Memories flooded me, nights when I patched uniforms under a single lamp, mornings when I sent them to school with food I'd gone without. When your father died, I had nothing but you boys and little Elena. I scrubbed floors until my hands cracked and bled. I skipped meals so you could eat. I smiled through humiliation so you could walk with dignity. My throat tightened, but I held the line. And how did you repay me? With shame, with silence, with laughter when your mother didn't fit your new world. Marcus shifted, muttering, "That's not fair, not fair." My voice sharpened, cutting through his defense. Do you remember Elena? The name struck them like a slap. Their eyes dropped, faces paling. Even Victoria blinked, unsettled by the sudden ghost at the table. She was your sister, I said, softer now but with a steel edge. You mocked me for crying too long, for clinging to her blanket. But you never knew the truth. I blame myself every day because I couldn't afford the care she needed. That loss built this restaurant. Every dollar I put into these walls was a stone on her grave, a promise that something good would live on in her name. My hand slipped into my purse. Slowly, deliberately, I placed Samuel's brass keys on the table. The little ring jingled faintly, their dull shine catching the candlelight. Next, I drew out the heavy silver keys to the restaurant, the ones that opened every door in the building, and set them beside the brass. The room inhaled as one, a collective gasp. 2 sets of keys, the past and the present, the life of sacrifice and the life of triumph. This, I said, resting my fingers over both, is what it means to build with love and loss. 1 set from your father's hands, 1 from mine. They are the story of everything I carried when you were too young to know. And tonight, they speak louder than all of you. Daniel leaned forward, his face red. So what? What are you saying? That you're more than just a shareholder? I looked him dead in the eye. I'm not a shareholder. The room went still, waiting. I am the owner, I declared, the sole owner. Every partner who once sat in these walls sold their share to me years ago. While you laughed at my uniform, I was buying piece after piece until nothing remained but my name on every line. The words rippled through the restaurant like a shockwave. Gasps, whispers, murmurs of astonishment. Victoria's chair screeched backward as she shot up. This is insane, she snapped, voice shrill. You're lying, you must be. But Joseph's hand reached out, steady, firm. He caught her wrist before she could storm off. Sit down, he said quietly, his voice breaking for the first time that night. We've done enough damage. Her eyes widened, furious, but she froze. The room was no longer on her side. I leaned forward, folding my hands. This place you thought too fine for me is the house I built. And tonight, you showed me you don't deserve a seat at my table. The words struck like lightning. Marcus's mouth fell open, but no sound came. Daniel clenched his jaw, fists trembling on the linen. Victoria glared daggers, but her power had dissolved into smoke. And Joseph, sweet Joseph, lowered his head as tears traced lines down his cheeks. The silence broke, not with jeers or mockery, but with applause. Soft at first, then stronger, until the room filled with the sound of hands meeting hands. Diners rose to their feet, clapping, some even cheering. The maitre d' bowed his head toward me. The owner smiled proudly, as if sharing in a secret victory. My sons shrank beneath the weight of it, their reputations, their polished images, their pride, all crumbling before strangers who had witnessed their cruelty. I sat back, the keys still glimmering on the table. My chest rose and fell, steady now, no longer burdened. For the first time in decades, I felt the scales of life shift back into balance. The applause faded, leaving a heavy silence broken only by Victoria's sharp breath. This isn't over, she muttered, venom dripping. I met her gaze, unflinching. Yes, it is. For you, it ended the moment you tried to strip dignity from the woman who gave you everything you take for granted. She looked away, lips pressed tight. Daniel dropped his head into his hands. Marcus leaned back, defeated. Only Joseph remained at my side, his hand still resting on the table near mine, as though anchoring himself to the truth. The brass keys caught the last flicker of candlelight, warm and worn, beside the cold silver ones that glittered with power. Together, they told my story. Together, they proved what sacrifice could build, and what arrogance could never destroy. And in that moment, I knew Elena's legacy had spoken at last. When the applause faded, the room returned to its rhythm, though nothing was the same. My sons sat in stunned silence, their faces pale beneath the chandeliers. I didn't gloat, and I didn't stay to watch their shame grow heavier. I had no appetite for revenge. I had only the hunger for peace. I rose slowly, gathering my purse and the 2 sets of keys. The brass jingled softly, the silver chimes sharper, the sounds blending like past and present entwined. I walked past their table without another glance. "Mom, wait," Daniel called, his voice rough. I didn't. At the maitre d's bow, I inclined my head politely. To the owner, I offered a small smile. Then I left the dining room, my heels clicking against marble as though marking the end of a chapter. In the quiet of the back corridor, I found the office door. I slid Samuel's brass key into the lock, an old habit from when I used to carry his set even after he was gone. The lock no longer belonged to that key, yet I turned it anyway, a symbolic gesture before slipping in the heavy silver one. It clicked, smooth and decisive, two worlds joined in one motion. My past and my present finally reconciled. Inside, the office smelled of polished wood and fresh paper. I set the deeds back into the drawer where they belonged. For years I had carried them close like a secret shield. Now I felt free to let them rest, no longer a weapon but a crown. A knock came at the door. Marcus's voice, muffled but urgent. "Mom, we need to talk, please." I didn't answer. Then Daniel's tone, sharper, demanding. "You can't just walk away." But I could. And I did. Only Joseph lingered. His knock was soft, his voice quiet, almost breaking. "I'm sorry, Mama. I should have stopped them sooner." The words pierced me, but I stayed silent. Forgiveness, if it was to come, would take time. That night, I wasn't ready to give it. I left them standing in the hall. For once, I would not shield them from the consequences of their arrogance. They would answer to the community, to the whispers that followed them, to the emptiness of knowing they had tried to humiliate the very woman who had carried them through storms. The restaurant became my second home after that night. Guests would smile warmly, calling me by name. The staff treated me with reverence, not because of the deed in my drawer, but because they knew the truth of how this place had been built, with labor, with sacrifice, with love that endured even betrayal. Sometimes Joseph visited quietly, sitting at the corner table with coffee. He never asked for money, never asked for favors. Only to sit and talk, to hear about his father, about Elena, about the life he had forgotten. There was pain in his eyes, but also humility. A seed of reconciliation, fragile but real. Daniel and Marcus came less often. When they did, they avoided the gaze of other diners. Their laughter was quieter now, their pride dimmed. Victoria, for all her fire, never returned. The door she had mocked me at had closed to her forever. And me? I found peace in dignity. For years I had begged, not for wealth, not for comfort, but for respect. That night I understood I didn't need to beg anymore. I had always deserved it. The brass keys stayed in my purse, worn but eternal, a reminder of promises I kept. The silver key to the restaurant hung beside them, proof that the past had not crushed me, but had instead sharpened me into someone unbreakable. I walked away from that confrontation, not with bitterness, but with pride. My children might stumble in the shadows of their choices, but I would no longer carry their shame. The tables of this restaurant would remain full, not of arrogance, but of gratitude. And each night, as the candles flickered against the glass, I sat at my own table, no longer invisible, no longer unworthy. I was home. Betrayal by strangers can wound, but betrayal by your own children, it cuts straight to the bone. That night, I learned the deepest pain comes not from enemies, but from the ones you carried in your arms, the ones you fed while you starved, the ones you prayed for when no one else would. My sons thought they could decide my worth with an empty chair. They believed wealth made them higher, and my silence made me small. But they forgot the truth. Dignity is not something others can hand you, and it is not something they can take away. I stood that night with keys in my hand, past and present united, and I showed them exactly who I was, not a servant to their pride, not a shadow at the edge of their table, but the owner of my own story, the builder of my own house. They tried to humiliate me, but I answered with patience, with justice, with truth, and in the end, they were the ones left humbled. So here is my lesson to you, listening now. Never let anyone decide your worth, not a boss, not a spouse, not even your children. Respect begins with how you carry yourself, and no amount of arrogance can take it from you once you know it. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated by the people closest to you? Share your story in the comments below, and if you want to hear more voices like mine, don't forget to subscribe.